Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Frank Guridy, the author of The Stadium, An American History of Politics, Protest, and Play. He's written 4 books and is a history professor at Columbia University. Dr. Guridy, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. The first time I became aware that sports is always about politics was on April 15th, 1997. I was about to turn 14 and went with my family to Shea Stadium, not only to see the Mets and Dodgers, but to see President Clinton honor the 50th anniversary of the reintegration of Major League Baseball. There was a buzz in the air. There were Secret Service agents everywhere, and we were all forced to recognize that baseball is not just baseball. It can push for social and political change. So in preparation for this episode, I looked back at the president's 6-minute speech. It was actually a little less, about 4 minutes, and he was dwarfed by the size and the echo of the giant stadium. And if you've been to Shea Stadium, you know that that echo was booming whenever someone spoke over the loudspeaker. And I remember that we all felt good about our country that day, like we were a part of something big. Looking back, Dr. Guridy, did I fall for propaganda designed by the establishment, or was that a day of genuine expression of joy at the positive change that Jackie made?
I'm so glad you start with that moment, a moment that I've forgotten about, actually.
Oh,
Probably both things are happening there. Certainly, that's the moment when the Clinton administration is certainly, like all administrations and politicians, looking for a historically significant moment, historically significant occasion about a historically significant person to sort of, make claims on what their policies are or what their vision is of America. So that's undoubtedly part of the case, but it is also true that I wasn't there, but I'm sure, I mean, just hearing you talk about it and knowing what I know about it, I mean, that certainly was a moment when there was things to feel good about the United States. That look how far we had come, look at the enormous impact of this individual, and not just those individual, him, but also the people who helped make that moment possible, the activists and people behind the scenes. So, and because it happens in the stadium, the just as you said, the sheer size of the building, the way these buildings are designed, it encourages that feeling of communion, right? So there's an orchestration there for sure, but of course, it's also a powerful moment of connection, communion, and a moment when the U.S. could feel good about itself. So I would say it's both.
and what message do those packed crowds and those stadiums send? People cheering and going crazy when someone walks out. I mean, we see that, Donald Trump uses that frequently at UFC events. He goes in college football games across the South. That is a powerful thing that politicians and political groups seize on, the potential to have all those people cheering at once.
No doubt, right? I mean, again, just this, when you've got tens of thousands of people packed into an arena like that, it's going to create an emotional response, and it's also going to create what Donald Trump wants, which is a sense of spectacle, right? And the stadium is a place that houses the spectacular and actually helps engineer it, right, in a lot of ways. So, that's part of the reason why, in the book, I argue that the stadium is inherently a political space because for over a century now, U.S. politicians have used it as a way to generate support and good feelings for their policies or their vision of America, right? So, yeah, I mean that's a scenario that's been replicated over and over and over again.
You're going to be able to tell that I'm a Mets fan from listening to this episode. I could probably do a whole episode just on the political history of Shea Stadium. 10 days after 9/11, at the same stadium, Mike Piazza hit what is now one of the most famous home runs in baseball history. The headline, I watched it again for the 5,000th time. The headline on the official MLB YouTube page says Mike Piazza's post 9/11 home run helps New York heal. That's the headline. Even Braves players and fans admitted afterwards that they felt good about their country again. And I'll admit, I still cry when I see that highlight. Um, have you been able to figure out why that happens? Why people on both sides of a game feel good about their country because of a home run hit at a stadium?
Yeah, well, I mean, my Piazza hit a lot of home runs, as you know, as a Mets fan,
Yeah.
um, because of the context, because of the trauma of September 11th, right? I mean, this is the first game back in New York after the towers are collapsed and after the crashing of Flight 93 and the crashing of the plane into the Pentagon. And it was an incredibly emotional occasion, right? And still a frightening one. I mean, one of the things I do in the book is I talk about this moment, probably why you're asking me, that and going over that period, which I lived through, right? Was really challenging, I have to say, because on the one hand, you're able to see the genuine spirit of connection, communion, and loss happening on that day, right? Just the same way you also see it when George Bush throws out the first ball at Game 3 of the 2001 World Series, just a couple of weeks later at Yankee Stadium, right? But then you're also seeing again the engineering of a political moment, right? The ways in which something that greatly disturbed me even at the time, the way in which loss became a commodity, the way in which the FDNY and the all these sort of the kind of ephemera associated with police and firefighters becomes something that is like a commodity. It becomes being sold and becomes a tourist item, to this day, right? And the ways in which the government used that moment to push policies that one could be very critical of, right? And so I think, whether it's the Giuliani administration or certainly the George W. Bush administration of that era, right? So I think that, I think that's what makes that period so challenging, tragic, and difficult to revisit. It was for me, I have to say, as I wrote the book, because you're seeing both of these dynamics happening at the same time. And I think that, but at the same time, when Piazza hits that ball over the center field fence, I mean, it's an incredible moment. The crowd goes crazy, and they, it's unleashing emotion, which is undeniable.
Stadiums are so interesting because we, as fans, at least 99% of the people in the world, never get good enough to spend time on the field at the stadium to really absorb what it means to be a part of the sport itself. We can speculate on it. We go, we drink our soda, our beer, we do our hot dogs, we cheer for our teams and our players. How do politics and social structures impact the way stadiums are constructed for the fans?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one obvious way that they affect how the stadium is constructed is that they're certainly since the 1930s, the New Deal era, and during and after World War II, the stadium becomes a de facto political institution because more often than not, its construction is contingent on politics. It's contingent on public dollars, either directly or indirectly, right? After World War II, whether it's Milwaukee County Stadium in 1953 that's built for the Braves franchise that moves from then Boston to Milwaukee and then later on moves to another state-funded stadium in Atlanta in 1966, and on and on and on. It starts this kind of this boom of publicly financed stadiums that are built to house teams for this emerging nationalizing sporting culture, pioneered by Major League Baseball, but then eventually by other leagues and other franchises in the NFL and NBA and the NHL, and then now soccer teams, right? So the stadium becomes a kind of political space because it's based on politics to make them possible, right? And as we've been talking about, they've also been a place where where politicians use that space to further their causes or to generate support and to generate unity, right? Because I mean, national or municipal unity should not be underestimated as a factor in history, right? So I think, and that's why they become de facto even political spaces, even though we imagine them to be apolitical, even though we imagine them to be a place you just go and see your favorite baseball player or your favorite concert performer. But at the end of the day, they're more often than not political because they're contingent on political processes to make them possible.
Um, how important is it that we recognize that it costs different amount of money to sit in different seats at the stadium? The supposedly better your seats are, although I'm a practitioner of sitting a little bit further up and a little further away to see the game better. Um, how important is that we recognize that it costs different amounts of money to sit in different places, and that is sort of a metaphor for the rest of society.
Yeah, it's pretty important, particularly as the stadium has become corporatized and really designed for more affluent crowds since the 1990s, right? I mean, if you look at the layout of stadiums now, whether it's a baseball stadium like Camden Yards, Oriole Park and Camden Yards, or even the refurbishing of Dodger Stadium or older facility, you see how much real estate is taken up by corporatized seating and also by premium seats and luxury suites, which used to be up in the upper decks, starting with the Houston Astrodome, which really inaugurates this process of the skybox, right? And now becomes takes up large amounts of real estate around the field itself, right? Premium seating, as it's often called, right? So seating capacities are smaller, particularly in baseball arenas, baseball stadiums, and so you have less seats available for your average person, and really the average person, if that person even exists, is often not found at a stadium, at least for a sporting event. They might be there for other reasons, perhaps. That does happen sometimes, and it has happened historically, as I talk about in the book. But by and large, the stadium today is an agent of gentrification. I've argued it's really designed for the 21st century American
And the
gent.
and the people who work at the stadiums are not exactly high dollar employees.
Absolutely not. These are seasonal workers and concession workers who are young folks or even older folks who are there, and also you see in certain ballparks, and I think we're using New York examples, but this is another one which I talk about in the book. The ways in which the work of security and the work of concessions is really reliant on people of African descent, Black and Latinx and people of color. It's a really striking phenomenon. At Yankee Stadium, if you go today, you'll see predominantly affluent white crowds being waited on by Black and brown people, right? Or their cars being parked if they're taking the car and parking the car in the garages near Yankee Stadium, right? So it's a bizarre reconstitution of a kind of class hierarchy and also a racial one in certain cases, not all over the country, but in many cases, the work of security and concessions is done by Black and brown people.
Your book opens with a description of the Barclays Center and the aftermath of the George Floyd killing, murder. People gravitated there to voice anger at what happened. Um, they even went to just the outside of the stadium. They gathered around the stadium. Are arenas the site of so much politics and protest because they're big places for people to gather, or does the fact that we're used to going there for sports make it easier for us to express ourselves there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's both, Evan. I think, of course, these are buildings designed to be accessible, right? Even those that are constructed in suburban environments are connected to freeways and usually some sort of rail transit or bus transit, right? Our beloved Shea Stadium, which you talked about, is an example. I mean, it's often been seen as a suburban ballpark or now Citi Field, but it's very much integrated into New York City because of the elaborate transit network that connects it, right? And that's the case with all of these arenas because that's how people get there, right? So de facto, they become that because they're also large, they're iconographic, they have this symbolic value and symbolic symbolism in the city. I mean, they loom over the landscape, surrounding landscape. And they become, the Barclays Center is really interesting because there's this plaza that's constructed outside the arena, and that's the plaza that gets repurposed by the activists in the summer of 2020 into this space of grieving and protest and an outpouring of outrage and also community formation. So, and also because the Barclays Center was a politically challenging project that also had been a controversial topic among Brooklynites, given the fact that it was built to provide, among other things, not just economic revitalization, but also affordable housing. And much of those promises were not delivered. So there was already kind of a tradition of gathering outside that plaza. So even though it's a plaza that advertises, Geico insurance and State Farm insurance or whatever the commodities being advertised, it becomes a de facto public space. A very interesting history there at Barclays Center.
I want to ask about you a little bit here. When and how did you realize that the story of stadiums and politics and protest had not been explored enough?
Yeah. So in my last book, I've been thinking a lot about the 1960s and 70s in this country. My last book looked at Texas' impact on American sporting culture in the 60s and 70s, in the period when the sport industry grows by leaps and bounds. And also the moment when the freedom movements are really reshaping our country, whether that's the Black freedom movement or the second wave feminist movement, and then later on the gay and lesbian movement. And so I had a chapter on that book about the impact of the Houston Astrodome and Texas Stadium, the first stadium that was built for the Dallas Cowboys in 1971. And I talked about that in terms of its impact on stadium architecture. And then I realized, like, you know what, that's a great story, and I wanted to tell that story, but I felt like, gee, the things that I'm seeing here in this story, I have a sense that I'm seeing them elsewhere in different ways. And so that led me down the road of like, okay, I'm going to write this book. And the more I dug around and I, consulted the vast archives that are available, because stadiums are ubiquitous, whether they're Candlestick Park or, the Chase Center in San Francisco, or whatever you're talking about, it became really easy to find material and then challenging to figure out, what do I incorporate and what do I don't, right? And I think I want to emphasize one other moment that I think was significant for me, going back even before this, which was living through the historic release of Nelson Mandela, the very famous anti-apartheid activist, his tour across the United States in 1990. And I mentioned this in my acknowledgments. And I remember I didn't go to the rally at Yankee Stadium, one of my regrets in my life. But I remember watching it on TV, and I remember seeing, like, wow, there's Yankee Stadium, this place where I go see the Yankees on a regular basis, become repurposed into this extraordinary gathering, celebrating a moment of social justice and historic change with Mandela's release, right? And so there's just so many examples of that in stadium history across this country that I felt like it warranted, an elaborated, closer look.
What are the sources that you use for this? You said there's a big archive of them and there's a big store of documents. When it comes to when we interview like a president, for instance, you go to the library and that's a good place to start. Where I assume there's no just archive of stadium and protests. So where do you find the material needed to gather for this book?
Yeah. Well, I am an archive rat, and that's part of the reason why I became a historian. I do like digging around. So, the archives of the stadium, American Stadium, are everywhere, right? And so sometimes they're in municipal documents, like, a Shea Stadium, a Yankee Stadium, a publicly financed, built arena has got material in municipal archives. One of the things I talk about in this book is the impact of college football stadiums, which are built by universities, up until the present, starting really in the 1920s, or really accelerating in the 1920s. So for my chapter on the history of segregation at the old Tulane Stadium, there was a plethora of material at Tulane's archives, the university archives, right? Then in looking at the freedom movements, there's just a vast array of materials of the NAACP papers in terms of the Black freedom movement, or, the gay and lesbian movement has amazing archives, digitized, documentaries, and also the very important Bay Area Reporter newspaper, which I used to write about the gay games movement in San Francisco in the 1980s, right? And so the freedom movements themselves have, a core, many civil rights activist organizations left behind material. Then there's the digitized archives. You just open up YouTube and you can reconstruct many, many events, as I do in this book, by just watching old telecasts and highlight film. Something I started doing in my last book, but the YouTube archive and the digital archive is enormously impactful for me, because it allows me to reconstruct moments, which I try to do in this book here and there, that used to be sort of enslaved to the accounts written by the journalists, right? And so, for example, you mentioned the Mike Piazza home run. I mean, that's boom, you can call it up on YouTube in a matter of seconds, right? But not just something like that, even obscure regular season games, or things that Sugar Bowl highlight films, which are all over YouTube and other parts of the internet. So that really has revolutionized my research experience. It's allowed me to consult a lot of material pretty quickly.
Does being in New York, do you think, with all those sports teams, you're at Columbia University, and there's also, of course, a vibrant political discourse in New York. I guess depending on how things are going,
Yeah.
does that feed your curiosity and ideas about the relationship between sports and politics? Just being there with 9 pro sports teams, a number of arenas, a number of universities.
Yes. Now, Columbia, God bless my institution, but it's not an athletic powerhouse. Although we have some very good teams here, but it's not my old job was at the University of Texas Austin, which is a whole
Oh
different
yeah, come
sort
on.
of athletic enterprise.
Yeah.
Absolutely, being here is extremely stimulating in a number of ways. Because of the fact that there's so many arenas that are historically significant, like Madison Square Garden, which I talk about in its different iterations, in the first chapter. But also, I think by, as I write about in the acknowledgments, being a native New Yorker and seeing, the vast array of people who would congregate at Madison Square Garden, at Yankee Stadium, at Shea Stadium, Jews, Italians, Irish, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Black people from a variety of backgrounds, and to see that and grow up with that, I consider myself extremely blessed to see how this building, can constitute communities and how it could divide communities for sure. But, to see that, ethnic, racial, and gender diversity was just fantastic, as a native New Yorker. So, I mean, that had a huge impact on me and in the long run and thinking about what this project became.
So A, are you a big sports fan? And B, are you still, or were you ever able to walk into a stadium and just enjoy the game and not sit there pondering the pressures of politics and sports?
Yeah, that last question is a good one. I love sports because I do believe that it's had an impact on our country, mostly for good, I would say. I mean, I think in our day and age, it's become super corporatized and it's big business, and I'm not convinced that it plays a positive role in our society. But in general, I would say, as somebody who grew up a child of the freedom movements in the 60s and 70s, it undeniably had a huge impact on me. And I enjoy sporting events. I mean, I'm going to the U.S. Open tennis tournament tomorrow. It's one of my favorite things to do. And certainly I could sit there and analyze things that are going on for sure, but I can still enjoy what sport gives us, which is feelings of connection, feelings of awe and inspiration, generated by extraordinary athletic or artistic performance. And so I'm able to do that. But at the same time, yes, my critical lens doesn't disappear. It does
Yeah,
not.
that's why you sit alone at all these games, right? 'Cause I'm just kidding. That's a
I know,
joke.
so I don't rain on people's parade. I know I always feel like raining on people's parade. I mean, my daughter likes going with me, so I'm not raining on her parade, I guess.
Yeah, the U.S. Open is so fun. I was there
One of
one
my favorite
time.
sporting events.
Yeah, it's so great. Going back to the history a little bit here, I have a few specific questions. What is the history of stadiums previous to our country? You got into it a little bit early on in the book there. When were the first ones built? What were they used for? And were they inherently political?
Yeah. Well, stadiums are, age-old institutions, right? And they date back to the ancient world, the ancient worlds of ancient Greece and Rome. The most famous, of course, being the Roman Colosseum, which remnants are still accessible to us today. I went to visit it last year, and it's an awe-inspiring building. And so, in those days, their uses were not that different than ours, right? I mean, they were there to showcase the marvels of the empire. They're able to showcase, entertain spectators who were there seated in this hierarchical manner, right? So that, the elite sat toward the bottom, the more, lower class folks sat near the top, right? So there's segregated seating in those structures, monumental architecture, seeing, things like, Christians of the Lions or, the gladiators or whatever it was in the ancient world. Then the stadium kind of disappears as the Roman Empire collapses. I mean, we have instances of structures that you could call stadiums, existing, moving into the Middle Ages and the early modern period. But it really isn't until industrialization in the 19th century, moving into the late 19th century, where we see the emergence of things like soccer stadiums, right? In England and other parts of the Americas and other parts of the world, right? And so when the US starts building stadiums in the aftermath of the Civil War, it's really in that period of industrialization and massive urbanization of people migrating to cities that creates this kind of constituency for what we now call stadiums.
Can we identify the first political event held in a U.S. stadium? I'm not talking about a game, but I'm like the first political moment that we is a firm and clear example of the intersection of sports and politics.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that even though stadiums and I'm starting when I say stadiums, I'm starting with circus tents and what become wooden constructed ballparks. The circus tents were also wooden constructed in the 1860s and 70s. They were constructed by private entrepreneurs, absolutely, right? So, this idea that the state would build stadiums, that didn't exist in the same way, but they were still contingent on some collaboration for the local elected officials, right? So when you start to see them being built, that's a political moment, right? Then you see, there's instances of the Star Spangled Banner being performed in the 1860s, right? Which is a thing I talk about in the dynamic of the book. I mean, it's not a recurring tradition until way into the 20th century to have the Star Spangled Banner played at sporting events. But it does start in the 1860s, right? So, and it makes sense because what's happening in the 1860s is a civil war, right? The nation has to reconstitute itself. It has to become unified again. And so any gathering space in that period of extraordinary division, it's going to become a political event because it's about how do you reconstitute this country in the aftermath of a bloody civil war. So, I mean, that's my sort of answer to the first moment. But I think that it really isn't until I do really track this phenomenon of the Star Spangled Banner being played at stadiums. I think it's a very interesting story. And I think that's really not until after World War I where you start to see that more frequently, and then moving after World War II. And so you usually find a moment when there's a war, and that's when you usually see the stadium being explicitly used as a way to kind of galvanize support for the nation.
What role did stadiums play in the original effort to segregate baseball in the 1880s, which is led by Cap Anson, who is sort of the the bookend to Jackie Robinson? And somehow Cap Anson is still a member of the Baseball Hall of Fame. I don't think anyone's ever been kicked back out, but certainly if there's a candidate, Cap Anson would be number one.
Yes, you can make that argument for sure. I mean, this is a story that we know very well. The ways in which, you know, baseball manifests, catalyzes racial transformations, whether it's segregation in the 1870s and 80s, we went to the 1890s, and then from there, or the desegregation of sports, as you mentioned earlier, with Jackie Robinson, taking the field at Ebbets Field for the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947, right? So no question that this emerging industry, and baseball, people forget, like in the 1870s and 80s, it's kind of a fledgling new thing that's emerging, right? And so it didn't become America's national pastime until the 20th century, right? And so in that period, with this new amusement that's emerging, right, it does create a space to articulate a white supremacist society. No question about that, right? But it's not just baseball ballparks. It's also college football stadiums and other stadiums as well, which I talk about in the book. I'm really fascinated by the ways in which, college football plays a central role in the imagination of the white Jim Crow South, right? In its self-presentation, in the ways in which it remembers the Civil War, and the way it obscures and mischaracterizes the history of slavery, right? The way in which it denigrates Black people. And so you look at a venue like Tulane Stadium in New Orleans, and it becomes a space for the showcasing for the nation of the white South, right? And it's Confederate legacy. It promotes in all the pregame and halftime pageantry, right? So as one of these important congregating spaces in American society, it becomes one of those spaces, along with others, where our racial understandings are being exhibited and fought over and displayed.
I have been to Madison Square Garden hundreds of times. There's nothing like the feeling of walking into that arena. It is the greatest arena for basketball and hockey, without any doubt. At this point, many of the other ones have been knocked down that are older. It is unbelievable to me that at one point, not in this iteration of the building, but in a previous iteration of Madison Square Garden, that there was a Nazi rally held. How do we deal with the old histories of our favorite teams and our beloved arenas, knowing that some of them have really ugly moments in their past?
No doubt. Again, anytime you're going to put tens of thousands of people together, or even just a few thousand, there's something extraordinary is going to happen and something terrible is going to happen. And that's certainly the case in the history of the American Stadium, right? The American Stadium shores up the status quo, and it also creates space for the challenging of the status quo, right? And so, Madison Square Garden, which we associate with the Knicks and the Rangers, right? In the 1920s and 30s, this pro hockey is just starting, right? Basketball is not a major recreational spectator activity in this country in the 1920s, right? Certainly not at the level of arenas, right? Madison Square Garden in that period was a political meeting hall. I mean, it is extraordinary when you go through the archives to see how many different organizations are using it. Tex Rickard, the very famous entrepreneur who basically takes over the lease of the garden around 1920, he kind of makes it into this showcase place, and it kind of has its identity during his reign, because he's able to bring everything into that building, everything from the dog shows to the circus to what becomes hockey when the garden moves to the west side in 1925. But also he's bringing in the National Democratic Convention in 1924, right? It's a place where communists and labor activists and socialists are having rallies. It's also a place where when the fascist movement, which is really circulated across the Atlantic world in the 1930s, is finding a home. So you could look at the garden as a space of staging an ignominious moment like the 1932-39 German-American Boon rally, and that was just one of a couple of the Nazi rallies that were staged at the Garden.
And
But also look at it as a space where, you see all this contestation, all these other movements that are advocating for the labor rights of the mass of immigrants who've come to New York City over the previous decades, right? So in some ways, it really showcases the kind of, you could argue, the kind of robustness of political culture at the time and the ways in which the Garden played a huge role in that story. But absolutely, this is one of the reasons why I wrote about that 39 German-American Boon rallies, because it has these interesting resonances with politics today, I would suggest. And I think also, yes, it's worth remembering the ways in which kind of reactionary movements have used this space for all sorts of purposes going back to the 30s and obviously before that.
and that rally, they have a huge picture of George Washington
That's
at the
right.
front. It's just a striking image for so many
It's
reasons.
chilling. It's chilling.
It really is. When do our arenas that are routinely used for basketball and hockey become the center of political conventions? Now, when they're held, I mean, I was at one in Tampa Bay. That was the Republican convention in 2012, and I walk back into that arena all the time for Lightning games, and I have this memory of this major political event happening at a stadium arena that is 99% of the time used for um, not generic, but routine sporting events.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so we just had the Democratic National Convention at the United Center in Chicago. And there is a perfect example of the function of arenas like this during the convention, not just the very carefully choreographed event inside the arena, but people protesting outside the arena, right? Those who are advocating for an end to the war in Gaza, for example, for the rights of the Palestinian people, right? I mean, that's just kind of standard procedure at a stadium, I would suggest, right? I mean, I sit there and say, look, here it's happening again, right? But so our political parties have used first auditoriums and then what becomes known as arenas in the late 19th century, right? So Chicago has hosted, different political conventions from both parties. I think the most of any other city. Going back to the Chicago Coliseum in the early 20th century, the Chicago Amphitheater, where the 1968 Democratic National Convention was held, to today's United Center, Chicago Stadium, the very famous arena where Franklin Roosevelt announces the New Deal in some ways, or makes his case for his candidacy as president in 1932, happens at Chicago Stadium, right? So those indoor arenas become extremely important political spaces, right? For mainstream politics, but also for activist ones too, right? And so I think that so it was actually fitting for this convention to happen at Chicago, which is a city that has a long history of this dynamic.
How important is it that we understand what happened in New Orleans at the Superdome? Um, the Hurricane Katrina had blown through, and that was seen as a place that people could be safe, and it ends up being a catastrophe. What do you believe is this sort of epitaph for that moment, and what does it teach us about stratification in our society?
Yeah, one of my regrets in this book is that I end the New Orleans story when the Superdome opens, because I couldn't cover everything. There's so much to cover, and I've talked about the Superdome a lot in these interviews. It's very interesting, because that 2005 moment of when the Superdome is used as a refuge of last resort, and the absolute horror that happened in that building, is something that etched in our memory, right, around the country, not just people in Louisiana. So yeah, I mean, there you go, seeing the kind of the repurposing of a sports facility, a space that again is seen as just a sports facility, used for other purposes, right? And the ways, I mean, it's a commentary on all sorts of things: the failures of the local government, the failures of the relief effort, the failures to provide safe spaces for evacuation, the absolute inadequacy of the public structures and the infrastructures of that city and that state at the time, absolutely. But then, evacuees that also go to the Houston Astrodome. I remember this very well because I lived in Texas at the time. And there you see, again, historically significant, iconic building being used, again, as a refuge for evacuees in a way that was much more positive. In some ways, they saw what happened at the Superdome, and they saw the mistakes that were made and the disasters that became, right? And so, but again, it shows you, even in these moments when they're improvised, how these buildings, are used for other purposes. So we saw this in 2020 when stadiums and arenas are used for vaccination and used for voting, right? They've been used for these sort of purposes because of the fact that the things that we said, they're centrally located, they're easily accessible, and they're also provided by the public, right? And so, I mean, in some ways, I suggest in this book that those are the functions that we should continue to expect from these buildings.
It would not be possible to have this conversation without discussing Colin Kaepernick. And that was a huge, I don't know if scandal is the right word, but a huge dust up. And to call it, that's a light term for it. But um, he had never played again. He became too radioactive, and now he probably would not be able to play in the NFL at this point, given how long it has been since he was a competitive football player. But my question is, if someone did the exact same thing tomorrow,
Yeah.
would they be ostracized the way that he was?
That's a great question, Evan. They would be ostracized, yes, for sure, because the stadium, even though as I'm arguing that it's been an inherently political space, certainly during sporting events, plenty of athletes who've tried to, stake claims or whatever their causes are, often cheered by the crowd, not by everyone, but by significant numbers of them for sure. I mean, we know this very famously with the 1968 protests of Tommy Smith and John Carlos at the Mexico City Olympic Games, right? When they staged their very famous Black Power salute. And they also were ostracized after that, right? Just because they just raised the fist in the magnifying environment of the stadium, right? On TV, of course, as well. And so Kaepernick, when he does this in 2016, I think the meaning, this is a really important point, the meaning of the stadium has changed. One that was seen as a civic space in which some forms of political expression were tolerated or even encouraged, right, as I show in the book, to a space that's seen only as a sport and entertainment industry space that is totally defined by the naming rights structure, right? The corporate names that are plastered all over these stadiums and the plethora of advertising that assault your eyes when you walk through them, walk into those buildings, right? The building gets remade into this corporatized apolitical space, right? And that's different from the 1960s and 70s, and I would argue even going back to the 20s. So that when he does what he does, he's facing a degree of persecution I think in some ways was unprecedented, right? Now, if that happens today, I think because of the Kaepernick case, I think it would play very differently, right? I think that the athlete would not be celebrated necessarily, although I think some people would celebrate them because I think standing up for justice in a public space is seen as a good thing by a lot of people in this country. But at the same time, they would also be, told to shut up and dribble, and things that we tend to hear from some political pundits.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that phrase, shut up and dribble. My next question was about the NBA and BLM warm up shirts. LeBron James is the most famous practitioner. Well, he's the most famous of everything, I guess, right? But he wore the BLM shirts and he said, "Why should I have to shut up and dribble?" Does that expression that he uses, "Why should I have to do that?" Does that show progress from the Kaepernick situation?
In some ways, yes, I think it does. Not just LeBron James, but of course, I think even more impactfully, all the WNBA players like Maya Moore and all these other folks who not only were just, wearing T-shirts, they were campaigning for a candidate for the U.S. Senate,
Right.
Raphael Warnock, right? Running against Kelly Loeffler that year, 2020 and 2021. I mean, like the WNBA players, in some ways are the most, politically expressive, I would argue in professional sports in this country, right? And so, along with the NBA players and other athletes as well. So, yes, I think in some ways, that 2020 moment was a moment of pushback where it's like, you know what? We are citizens. We don't just go out here and entertain you. We care about society, care about equality, we care about justice, right? And that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the coming, weeks and months that are left of this election. I mean, I think we're in a different moment in 2024. But, for example, More Than a Vote is being remobilized, right now, which is LeBron James's, organization that he founded at that time, right? And so, I mean, you're going to see people campaigning for, for certain candidates or just to encourage people to vote, which is something that I think we do see more frequently now since 2020, which I think is a good thing, right? I think athletes should, at the minimum, encourage people to vote and actually go vote themselves, right? And so I think that that's been a positive transformation, I would suggest, since 2020 or since that period.
Just I can't believe we're talking about 2020 and 2016 like the distant past.
History. Yeah.
It's crazy. How can we all become more aware of how stadiums are impacting our political thought when we're A, away from the stadium, but B, while we're in the stadiums?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the things we can do is, I'm critical of the ways in which the sport industry has, sort of overdetermines the way we think about what stadiums are, right? But what we saw in 2020 were sport franchises really collaborating, cooperating in the conversion of stadiums into, polling stations and vaccination sites. Now, they don't, and here's the thing, franchises don't own most of these stadiums. The vast majority of them are publicly owned, right? So that means if we're going to build them, right, how do we build them in a cost-effective way? How do we build them in a way in which we get maximum usage of them and that they're widely accessible, right? I think we assume because there's these corporate names on these buildings that they're owned by the Los Angeles Lakers or by, whatever, or the corporation whose names is plastered on the name of the facility, but most of the time they're owned by the public, right? And so if that's true, then how do we make use of these things, or why should we keep building them, right? And can we build them in ways where we really get more maximum usage than what we do, particularly those like football stadiums, which are only used, 7, 8, 9, 10 times a season.
Yeah,
It doesn't make any sense to build something like that, and then it sits around dormant for most of the year. So I mean, that's the thing I want the reader. In some ways, this book is a challenge to us. It's like trying to show you the history so you could say, okay, if we have these buildings, if we love sports, why not use them in the ways that they've been used in the past in this country?
I only have the advanced reader copy of the book. It does not include the dedication in that edition of it. Who did you dedicate the book to and why?
Yeah, my parents, because my stadium story starts, and we already kind of talked about this, like the way many people do, taking the games by my dad and my mom, right? In the late 70s, early 80s, growing up in New York City. And that's when I remember walking into Yankee Stadium, in the late 70s when Reggie Jackson was at his peak of his powers and the Yankees were winning pennants and creating all sorts of controversy off the field. In the press as well.
Right, the Bronx is burning. That's another political
burning,
moment,
and then
right?
also, the Bronx Zoo, which was, Peter Goldenbach's book about the Yankees at the time with Steinbrenner and Billy Martin and Reggie Jackson. So I came of age in that era, right? And then going to games myself as a teenager, taking the subway or the bus and going to Shea, Yankee, or, those are the places I tended to go. NFL stadiums were really beyond the reach of my finances at the time. But yeah, so my parents, introduced me, thinking, oh, I'm just going to take my kid to games and he's going to like it. And I did. And I was totally fascinated by the environment. And I remained so here in my early 50s.
What is next for you? Do you think you'll do another book on sports and the intersection of sports and culture, or?
That's a great question. I'm kind of caught between a number of ideas. I've been thinking about sport and politics, sport and justice and social movements, for now, I guess, 10, 11, 12 years. But I'm leaning towards thinking about a book about the anti-apartheid movement. I mentioned the Mandela rally, and I just feel like it's an extraordinary story, which we talk about, but I'm not convinced that most Americans really know how the amount of labor it took to make sure that apartheid ended in South Africa, right? Around the world. So I'm toying with the idea of a history of the anti-apartheid movement, right? I mean, that's one thought I've had. I'm thinking about going a little more global than I have in my last two books.
Dr. Frank Guridy, the author of The Stadium, An American History of Politics, Protest, and Play. Thank you so much for being here.
Evan, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Check out the book and his social media feed on the website formerly known as Twitter at @FGuridy. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.